Welcome to Conflict Managed. I'm your host, Mary Brown. Conflict Managed is a weekly podcast about toxic work environments and how to fix them. We're glad you're here. Good morning, Richard, and welcome to Conflict Managed.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you for inviting me.
I've been really looking forward to our conversation and hearing all that you have to say and what your experiences have been with helping other people work through their conflict. For quite some time, you've been at this project, so I know you've got lots of wonderful lessons and things for us to think about. But before we get there, I would like to hear about the first job you ever had as a young person.
I was a dishwasher in a French restaurant in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and that served me really well. I think that everybody ought to work behind the scenes in the food industry. You'll never be mean to a server again, and it helped me in a great many ways in my life because if you do know the food service industry, you know that sometimes some of the employees don't show up. And that meant as a dishwasher, I got recruited into sometimes being a prep cook. And if you learn to use a knife and you learn to cook, that ends up being a lifetime skill. So very grateful for that first job.
That's wonderful. I mean, there are so many interesting things that we can learn from our first jobs because we're out in the world, and then all of a sudden, in a way where we are moved from sort of whatever our childhood is to just with all different kinds of people and what happens when people show up and do work well and when they don't. And
Hmm.
if we show up, the kinds of things we can learn along the way.
You bet.
So, where did you go after being a dishwasher?
Dishwasher, college in New Orleans, did a lot of language, performing arts. I was, for most of my time there, a math major. So I
Hmm.
kind of had one foot in hard sciences, things with answers, and one foot in things where there were really no answers, just the next performance. Um, Back to Massachusetts for law school. And after law school, my first job out was as an assistant DA in the most populated county in Massachusetts. I
Wow.
did that for about 4 and some years. And so that was also hugely important in my career. Um, from there, I decided that I wanted to go back into teaching or wanted to go into teaching. Thought I was going to teach matters related to criminal law. And when I was back in school, I got kind of, I guess, discovered. Um, I was told by some people who would be incredibly influential in my life that what I ought to be teaching is negotiation, mediation, decision making, and conflict resolution. Um, so I started doing that in just about January of 1991,
Mm-hmm.
and I've been at it since.
Wow. Well, let's go back just a little bit into college. So, in college, you're doing math and theater or language and all of these things,
Hmm.
right brain, left brain. And then you go into law, which is a really a lovely marriage because there's the art and the science behind the
Hmm.
law, right? But why law school? You could have done so many different things.
Candidly, law school is the last bastion for liberal arts.
Mm.
I was technically a Russian major. I knew I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to, in those days, just go to New York and try to make it as an actor. And so I thought about going to an important drama school. They call them the League schools.
Mhm.
Um, and I had a year off because I had missed the audition deadlines. I hadn't really thought about it. Um, so, on a bribe from my parents, I went to law school for a year. And so there was no like, I'm going to go be a lawyer and take over the world. I mean, it really was kind of, I was killing a year. Um, and as you say, law turned out to be, at least law school,
Mhm.
turned out to be an incredible marriage of the logic associated with a mathematical proof,
Mhm.
together with all of the human elements of persuasion, social work. We have this sort of great legal edifice, but then it applies to individual people.
Mhm.
Um, so that was the beginning of just kind of really integrating a lot of what had come before uh, for me to think about decision making in a human context.
Mm.
So it turns out that that was a skill that I developed without knowing it in the
Mm.
DA's office that would prove to be super useful for the rest of my career.
Yeah, and I always love to give a shout out to the humanities because there are many parents who want their children to be gainfully employed. And if their child says, I'm studying Russian literature, they might say, to what end? You know? Um,
Sure.
and yet, I mean, maybe you can give an ode to it, but the critical thinking, the ability to reason well, that you get from studying literature is something you have for the rest of your life.
Yeah, and if you grow up in Eastern Massachusetts, you also get served a lot of donuts in Dunkin' Donuts by kids with PhDs in philosophy. So you're keenly aware that not everybody who studies a particular discipline gets to be gainfully employed in that discipline. Um,
Right.
but the thinking, the sort of learning, the things that are just end up being super important in any career.
Mhm.
Um, one of my kids, for a moment, was a physics major, and when they were talking about being, you know, a physics major and what did you do with that, um, turns out career counseling said that people who study physics get every kind of job because what they end up being super good at is analytical skills and projects and problem solving.
Mm.
So they don't necessarily end up working in the sciences. So to all the parents out there, let your kids go with their passion and cross your fingers and hope for the best.
That's right. And talk a lot about transferable skills. How to articulate what it is that you have had and the experiences from dishwashing all the way forward, because there is something that can be learned. And it's just a perspective a way to think about the experiences of making us who we are, and then how we can offer that to the client or the person in front of us or a community, whatever it might be.
A friend of mine just said that they saw a book that they're going to buy for me, and it's called How to Watch Basketball Like a Genius.
Hmm.
And apparently, there's a chapter from a physicist. There's a chapter from a mathematician. There's a chapter from an economist. And they're all analyzing the game of basketball, some of them probably thinking about spin and rotation and inertia, and others thinking about team dynamics. And so, just what looks like a simple game of sport, if you look at it through various kinds of deep critical lenses, apparently there's a lot more there than meets the eye.
Yeah, that's so funny that you bring that up because I was in preparation to talk with you. I was watching some of your videos, and you have a short little video about eight disciplines to master
Oh yeah,
conflict
uh-huh.
resolution, and how multifaceted it is. And it is interesting because obviously so much about conflict resolution and negotiation is about reframing, thinking in different kinds of ways, learning from different disciplines. So getting outside of yourself to find these different avenues. And so whether it's watching basketball or dealing with conflict, negotiation, the more the merrier.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the uh, fondest memories that I have was I was sitting with somebody who would do work that would later lead to a Nobel Prize,
Mm.
and they were a basketball fan, and they were talking about what's called the hot hand. Um, you got a player who seems to be shooting really well
Mm.
today. And so there's this sense of like, oh, such and such is having a great day. Keep giving them the ball. They have what's called the hot hand. And so there's this belief among sportscasters broadcasting games. It's like such and such is hot today. Well, it turns out that these psychologists who did economic statistical analysis, um, there is no such thing as the hot hand. Everybody kind of turns out by the end of a game to be pretty close to their lifetime average.
Mm.
And yet, what's salient? Why is it that we start to see like a couple of shots in a row and those become super vivid,
Yeah.
and we attribute too much to them? So just very interesting to think it's like I was just watching basketball and here's somebody next to me who's going to go on to win a Nobel Prize is thinking about decision errors that the public and sportscasters are making and using it to advance research on how humans approach all decisions. So fascinating, So it was one of those anything leads to everything.
Oh, I love that. That is such a great example of, what draws our attention. I remember before I had children, I never really thought much about children. I didn't babysit. I wasn't really a person that was so inclined, maybe. And then all of a sudden I got pregnant and the world was pregnant. And I saw strollers on every corner where there were not strollers before, right? And so of course, it is the same thing with the good and the ill of the people we work with, right? What draws our attention and what we focus in on, and the other things fall away, which means that it's not always a great indicator, especially when we're in conflict. We think everything is like that instead of, no, I'm looking, now I'm seeing it. And so because I see it more, and maybe I'm reading more into it.
Yeah, there's so much going on there. I mean, some of it is, as we talked about, just the idea of salience.
Hmm.
When you buy a white car, all of a sudden you notice how many white cars there are on the road. You get pregnant, which I've never been, but I've been partnered. Um, you start to notice strollers and all those, there's so much, and we have limited attention.
Hmm.
So we have to focus on a subset of things. And it
Hmm.
turns out that without realizing it, we focus on things that are subliminally keep coming up in our minds,
Hmm. Yeah.
right? So, yeah,
Well, I want to go a little
interesting.
bit backwards for
Sure.
your job. And so the first job out of law school, you were an assistant district attorney. What
hmm
did you said that was a very important job for you and that you learned a lot. What are the kinds of things that you learned in that position?
Um, well, there was a lot. Did a lot of jury trials. It was a very busy time in a very busy county. Worked very closely with a lot of people who had bad things come into their lives uninvited.
Mm,
Um, I think if you work in law enforcement or you work in emergency medical services, you see a different side of the world because you are invited into people's lives. Well, you enter into people's lives uninvited,
hmm.
often at moments that are very difficult for them.
Yeah.
Um, I originally thought, oh, it's a law and order job, and then you realize, no, it's not. It's a social service job. Back when I was in the DA's office, you could basically look at a list of crimes that happened over the weekend, and 80% of them were alcohol abuse.
Mm,
I just spent a month serving as a grand juror in Portland, Oregon, and about 80% of the crimes were associated with untreated mental illness.
mm,
And so you really, you may think that you're some law enforcement person, but the there but for the grace of God go I,
mm,
or at least my friends or people that I know. Um, I mean, that's an important aspect. And so, in the DA's office, you realize the legal system is part of a bigger social fabric. It doesn't exist by itself. And so the
mhm,
connection between the law and the rest of the world, it's a little less stark than it's often portrayed.
mm.
If you watched when if you're watching a crime drama, you're not seeing the day-to-day stuff. You're seeing sort of big highlights,
Right.
important things that tend to be unusual. And for a while, something that I didn't realize was going to be super impactful was I was on a child sexual assault task force. And one of the skills that I walked away from that time was learning the importance of asking the hard questions because you have to make your case. You
Mhm,
can't be shy just because somebody is tender years and had terrible things happen to them. Um, You're in court, you need to prove a case, you need to ask those questions, and you can't turn everybody in the courtroom off,
Mm.
right? Everybody, so this idea, and that would translate later into mediation and conflict resolution, where the neutral third party has to be the person who can ask whatever, is that solution really going to work? Is there the
Mhm.
money? Is there the will? What happens if? And so a lot of times people enter into agreements to resolve a conflict. And what they really want is they just want the conflict to be done.
Yeah.
And they're not really paying attention to the details. And they basically are just laying the seeds for a later, bigger disagreement. Um, so for me, working in the DA's office, well, jury trials certainly teach you something about how to capture and keep attention. Um, and so if you're going to be a teacher or you're going to be a mediator or you're going to do big group facilitations, that sort of working with a crowd, working with difficult issues, and like I say, being able to make sure that everything that needs to get addressed gets addressed, even if it's very uncomfortable. I think that those are some skills that I walked away from in the DA's office. Also, some of the stuff that was pretty clear. For every case we tried, we resolved 15 or 20 more cases without trial. And, people sometimes the idea of plea bargaining sounds nefarious, like you're letting people get off on technicalities or you're, sort of giving favors to people. But really, nothing could be further from the truth. There's so much scrutiny. The press is in the courtroom. If you take a murder trial and you say, "Oh, we're just going to charge you with trespassing," um, your boss, the DA, is going to be in the newspaper, and an awful lot of things. Like let's just say, first time drunk driving. Um, Endemic. I mean, I started right around the same time Mothers Against Drunk Driving was forming.
Mm.
So the consciousness around that had evolved just before I started in the office. And there was a single outcome if you were a had no record and you got caught drunk driving and there was no injury, you were offered this program where you would alcohol treatment, you paid certain fines, and after a certain period of time, it would disappear off of your record, uh, or it would be filed on your record in such a way that you could honestly answer, or say, if you wanted to join the military, I have never been convicted of certain kind of crime. So it was a law that ended with the letters and numbers 24J, and everybody who came in who fit that profile got that offer,
Mhm.
and you couldn't go below it. I mean, there was no, this was just to prevent disparities. And it's like, oh, you look like me, so I'll give you a break, but you don't look like me, so I'm going to throw the book at you. Um, there was, one standard. Um, So a lot of what we learned in plea bargaining was just kind of how to value a case, how to see what it was, and make an offer that was within a range. Um, if you try, depending on what place you're at in your career, when you're starting out, you're doing smaller cases, so you're doing more of them. And when you advance, you're doing bigger cases, you're doing fewer of them. But if you're doing between 2 and 20 trials a week,
Mm.
um, that means you are resolving without trial 100 or so cases a week. And when that's happening, you're just trying to keep your head above water. And then you stop and you look back and you say, I think I learned a thing or two about negotiation.
Right.
Um, so obviously those skills, and I was lucky enough after about 2 years to be brought into the training arm of the office. And so I got to work with lots of wonderful people as interns, new DAs. And that's when I started to realize, for me, teaching was going to be an important part of my career.
Ask you this. So you've got the law that is cold and detached. It is what it is. And then it's applied to the messiness. And as you said, the awful circumstances that these people find themselves in. How do you see so much human tragedy and then go home and do your hobbies and be with your family? And what kind of mechanisms have you always been good about separating those things, or what kind of coping mechanisms have allowed you to be in conflict resolution field for your whole career?
Um, well, it's an interesting thing to look back and see kind of, why in retrospect, a lot of things make sense. Um, so I guess the first one is my parents were Holocaust survivors. So I'm first generation, once removed from that. Um, so the idea that humans can inflict horrible pain on other humans, um, I guess I kind of grew up with that being part of the fabric of my upbringing.
Mm,
Um, so uh, I don't I don't know for sure. Somebody more objective than me would have to analyze that. Um, but I think in part that prepared me to be able to hear the kinds of horrible stories that victims and survivors tell about crime
mhm,
um, without reacting,
mm,
just listening. And it turned out that was another thing that, sometimes you're doing something and someone says, "Oh, you're good at that." And you're like, "Really? I thought this was second nature. Other people aren't good at this."
right.
And one of the things that I got complimented for was I could listen to victims and survivors tell pretty horrific tales and just say, like, without being cold, okay, and what happened next? But so you mentioned that you were pregnant at some point. I assume you have kids.
Yes.
Um, well, we all know that, those of us who've been around children enough know that a kid of a certain age falls down, and the first thing they do is look at the parent
Right.
and they want to say, "Should I cry?"
Right.
And
Right.
if the parent reacts with horror, the kid cries. And if the parent says, "You're fine," the kid goes on. Well, the same is true when you're talking to somebody who's been involved in crime. If they tell you something about the background, they're not even at the story yet.
Hmm.
They're just talking about on the way to pick up heroin,
Hmm.
and you react to that. Well, they're going to change their story.
Yeah.
Um, so that was part of it that I think I was already able to hear about. You grow up and your parents are talking to other Holocaust survivors, and you're a little kid playing and watching TV, and that's the background chatter. Um, at some point, you learn to not be reactive to every terrible thing.
Mm,
So that's part of it. Now, the second one was when people said, "Don't you feel unsafe knowing everything that's going on in the community?" And I was like, "No, actually, strangely, I feel more safe and more reassured than ever because I have information." And I'd
mm,
be looking at the first lines of a police report, and they would say, "I'm just making, you know, making something up and conflating a bunch of things." They say, "So when I was in this horrible, weird bar at 1:30 in the morning," and I'm already like, okay, I wouldn't be there. I wouldn't, right? And then the drunk gang members on motorcycles came in and started to make trouble. I'm like, okay, I'm out of there. And then it's like, I felt it was important for me to say, "You guys have to calm down," which I was like, I would never do that. And I would just look at these things, and the I mean, there were two reactions. One is, man, people put themselves in situations that are really perilous, and they kind of wander in, uh, and wow, there's a lot of folks who need a real lot of help,
mhm.
at many different levels. Like, what are you doing in a bar at 1:30 in the morning trying to score drugs from strangers? I mean, like, that's a person who needs some. But always, I was like, I wouldn't have been there, and I would have exited the scene. And I just thought the amount of crime that I'm seeing that actually happens to folks who are trying to avoid it and mostly doing a pretty good job, um, crime's pretty rare.
Mm.
I mean, you get into some cognitive and behavioral psychology, and you think, there's something called the availability heuristic, which is vividness acts as a surrogate for commonality. Um, an event that is uh, very vivid, um, a murder in your community, um, well, that's going to get lots of press over and over, going to occupy more brain space uh, than really it warrants in some respects. The analogy I often give is if you drive in any major city in the world for an hour, I'm going to guess that you have seen more than 5,000 other vehicles, right? You get on a highway. I don't even know. I was just in Los Angeles last week, and at one point there were 7 lanes on one side and 5 on the other. You drive for a couple of hours, and at the end of that drive, you remember the 2 idiots who, like, one of whom changed lanes too fast and one of whom beeped their horn, and you ignore the 5,000 or 10,000 other people who behave perfectly normally,
Yeah.
right? So we are drawn to the very unusual, the vivid, the things that stick out. I think for survival reasons, it
Mhm.
makes sense that we're tuned to that. The driver who doesn't represent a threat, whatever, I'll think about something else.
Mhm.
The driver represents a threat. Well, all of a sudden, those start to occupy huge amounts of real estate.
Mhm.
Um, so I think when people think about crime, um, they're inundated with a steady diet of very unusual events. And in the DA's office, I had context for how unusual they were, how easy they were to avoid, and how incredibly rare it was that something happened between total strangers.
Mm.
So when you ask kind of, uh, how did I come home? Strangely, the reality was I felt safer with the actual information than just being a member of the rank and file citizenry, only hearing about the stuff that made it into the front page of the paper.
It's such an interesting response. And it makes so much sense because we are given a certain information and we fill in the holes. And as you said, those things that are these red flares, then they just keep on beeping at us. And then there's another beep and it just adds. And all of a sudden, we only have so much space in our mind to occupy with stories and news. And then, if it bleeds, it leads. And so those are the sorts of things. I've thought my whole life that the news lies unintentionally, lies by omission. If they were supposed to give equal time to what's going on in a community, I'd be hearing about all the people on my street who are giving to food pantries, who are doing their children's homework with them, who are, and then every once in a while there would be the break-in. Every once in a while there would be, I mean, I lived in a small community, so every 5, 6, 7 years there would be the murder. It's that's the real truth. But
Right,
and but what we actually get, and I'm not saying that the news should not report these things, but what it does to us is that we get this unrealistic, we get this misshapen view of what the dangers are. Like when I was a kid, I thought quicksand was going to be a real thing, and I spent a lot of
yep,
brain space trying to figure out how I was going to get out of quicksand. Apparently, not a big deal of where I live. So,
right. Well, one of the things I like to joke about is, I might ask students in a classroom or a group of people at a workshop, so tell me about your opinion of nursing homes. And they say, oh man, they're just, rife with abuse. And I say, okay, so how many times have you opened the newspaper and there's a story that says of the tens of thousands of nursing home and care facilities in America, nothing went wrong in any of them today? How many times do you read that story? And they say, never. I've never seen that story. And it's like, yes, because that story would be boring. Um, no lawyers in town cheated their clients today. No doctors committed malpractice. No, I mean, the normal
right,
thing.
right.
But when one person in a nursing home neglects one elderly person, that's in the news and that story is followed up. And so over time, the only thing we hear about nursing homes are stories of abuse. And so in our little file cabinet in our head of nursing homes, it's full of stories about abuse. Why did those come to our attention? They came to our attention because they were highly unusual. And then our head is full of information that's highly unusual, and we forget that it's unusual when we go to retrieve. Um, I don't know if you ever watched The Simpsons, um, but one of the jokes in that running jokes is that all the fish have three eyes because they're near the nuclear power plant. And one of the opening sequences, the mom, Marge, goes to the supermarket and buys a fish, and it has three eyes, and she doesn't even notice. Why? Because all the fish have three eyes. They're all unusual. And so when our memories are full of things that are unusual, we become desensitized to the fact that they exist in our brains and that we can retrieve them because they're rare and different. Um, that ends up being, a hugely important concept in conflict resolution. We all hear about the very unusual. It's like, oh, the person who is a trillionaire and in their divorce settlement only has to pay their ex 1 penny a month. Because nobody's sitting around telling stories about, I am paying exactly the statutory requirement,
Right.
right? No one's kind of bragging about kind of anything that's average, but yet average is the bulk of.
Right.
um,
So, how do you see this principle at work? At work. So, we're going about our business, we've got colleagues, something happens, and then we start telling ourselves a particular narrative about that colleague in relation to me or in relation to the organization or within organizational structures.
oh, well, geez, just staying on that principle of like availability. Oh, did you hear such and such? They cut one of their fingernails a little bit too closely, and they got a month of paid time off. Okay, probably a not true story,
Right.
but immediately everybody feels like, well, that didn't happen to me. Oh, such and such got a promotion. It must be because, right? And so we see events and we don't have all the information. The ones that flood through office gossip, um, much like the press, um, when you see two people close together and they're gossiping, they're not saying to each other all excitedly, nothing really happened at work today. Right? They're telling some story, and the story, like the game of telephone, tends to enlarge. And all of a sudden, we're making comparisons because one of the basic human needs is to be, I'm going to say, further from the bear, right? There's that joke, two people are camping and they hear a bear, and one says, oh, I'm going to run. And the other one says, well, you can't run faster than the bear. And they say, I don't have to run faster than the bear. I just need to run faster than you. And so when people go into new jobs, they want to know where am I in the riff order?
Mhm.
If I'm a lateral, am I going to be the reduction in force? If we
Mhm.
get smaller because I'm the newest person, am I the first to go? Or because I got hired after decades at another place, do I retain my riff order?
Mhm.
Um, when we think about economic circumstances, there's some really interesting work where, and I'm just going to kind of make up numbers. People are told that upon graduation from their MBA program, they could take a particular job in a particular community, and either they can work for company A and they will make $120,000, whereas the average person in their company makes 125, or they can be in company B and they can make 110,000, whereas the average person in their company makes 105. If you're going to be in the same community, I would rather have 10,000 more dollars. But the vast majority of people prefer to make 110 when their colleagues are making 105 than rather to be making 120 when others are making 125. And so why? For me, that's that sort of illusion of further from the bear.
Mm.
I just don't want to be the first closest, right? I don't want to be the one that gets picked off. Um, so a lot of behavior in work is really to try to move away from the kinds of dangers that happen at work,
Hmm.
which are dangers associated with your economic well-being.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think and talk a lot about healthy work environments, and gossip is interesting. It's always telling us some good piece of information. I mean, I think gossip is a red flag. Something is going wrong here in the sense that in the sense of gossip is backward looking and kicking people when they're down. And there are different ways in which we can
Sure.
have community with one another, but it's a sign to the people who are supposed to be paying attention that something is going on here. How do we have a healthy work environment where people aren't why are they gossiping? It's because there's maybe not enough information, maybe there's not enough community, maybe there is it's a kind of protectionism because we need these jobs to pay our mortgages and so on and so
Hmm.
forth. And also I think about this when people call something petty. I don't think there's really anything petty at work. It's about where am I in the pecking order? And
Yep.
why is somebody getting this favor and I'm not?
Yep.
Where's the justice here? And healthy work environments, I think managers and leaders who take that is as serious information. Okay, what's going on under? What's this need that they have? They're saying this, but why are they saying this? And what are the conditions such that this is being allowed, encouraged? What are the other kinds of things we can do to speak into that person so that they can let that go, or it can be dealt with and we can move forward?
Um, Absolutely. There's so much in what you just said. Um, one of them is one of the most important uh, principles in conflict resolution is there's text and there's subtext.
Mhm.
Um, Typically, people have wants that we can relate to. I just want to feel safe. I want to feel secure in my job. I want to know that I can feed my family. Um, we can relate to those things. The behaviors that people then exhibit to further those goals can be horrifying. And often in conflict resolution, it's not the underlying interest that matters, it's the approach.
Right.
Another little story I like to tell parents relate to is you walk into the kitchen in the afternoon and your 4-year-old has taken a chair and piled a box on top of it and put a toy on top of that and puts a pillow on top of the toy. And they're standing on top of this rickety pyramid trying to reach something on the top of the refrigerator. And you, of course, come in and say, "Get down from there." And what the kid might hear is, "You don't care that I'm hungry. I was trying to get something that you made for me to eat. And I was trying to show my independence and I was trying to take care of my needs. And you don't care." And the parent, maybe after they've calmed down, if they recognize this, can say, "The underlying need is legitimate. Your way of approaching it and trying to achieve it was highly problematic.
Mhm.
So let's talk about, is there a different way to accommodate the need?" And that's where creativity and conflict resolution comes in.
Mhm.
Um, but those downward spirals, parent shouts at the kid stays mad for days, um, friction in the household, um, all avoidable if people would sort of learn, managers would learn to see a behavior like gossip, and instead of taking it at face value, and there are things that need to be taken care of in that moment, if hot water is spilling, you shut the spigot off.
Mhm.
Um, but stepping back and saying, okay, why is this occurring? Often there's something more legitimate and more interesting, and frankly, much more satisfying and useful if you can resolve it.
Mhm. Absolutely. So you do a lot of teaching since the 90s in conflict resolution, negotiation, and there's something, of course, very different about learning theory and different principles and developing your toolbox and then using the
Mhm.
theories, applying it. How has your approach to teaching people so that it won't just be in their heads, but they're able to actually use it in their own life and then in their clients, help clients. What are some mechanisms, or what do you do to help get past just a file in the head to actually doing, practicing?
Um, all right, so now we're getting into some theories of teaching that I'm not sure I'm 100, I have my own experience. But what I believe is that the most durable lessons are ones where you have an emotional attachment, a connection. Um, Sometimes you can create those by looking backward. We already have files. I mean, one of the things, if you're teaching somebody negotiation, um, I'll compare it to, like, I had colleagues who were teaching people antitrust. Um, I don't know about you, but by the time I was 10 years old, I didn't know anything about antitrust. But by the time I was 10 years old, I knew an awful lot about negotiation because I had to figure out strategies that worked for me to get things that I cared about. And I knew I had to work with other people. So by the time somebody gets to law school, the antitrust teacher could just be making things up on day one. And people will be like, I guess I have to memorize this. A negotiation teacher can find common human experiences that are deeply emotionally embedded and start to use those as a base.
Mhm.
So parenting, interactions with siblings and folks at the workplace, or there are common experiences we've all had by the time we reach law school age and certainly beyond. Um, so in terms of teaching, that's a big one. Second, and I think this is one of the reasons why I was so attracted to teaching negotiation, decision making, and conflict resolution is it's everywhere. It's everywhere all the time.
Mhm.
And so easy to create simulations. I could talk to somebody who all they cared about, and I'm thinking of one particular student, all they cared about was a certain level of car racing that was below Formula One, called CART, K-A-R-T. That's all they cared about. They said, when we were talking about negotiation and conflict resolution, they had to write a paper. They were like, I can't think of a topic. And I was like, what do you love? And they were ashamed to admit that they cared more about this particular kind of racing than they did about most of the law. I said, well, I bet there's conflicts in racing. I bet there's conflicts about, like, photo finish, behavior during the race, who gets to qualify. There's probably a million rules. And how do those all get worked out? Um, why don't you find that? Go there. And he wrote a paper called Conflict Resolution in the Motorsports Industry. It actually got published. He ended up getting a job being an administrative law judge who worked part-time resolving disputes in the racing industry. Um, so because the process of making our own decisions and working with others is ubiquitous,
Mhm.
I like to say I teach verbs and I'm agnostic about the nouns. So if you're looking at kind of, in the same way that we talked about that the genius watching basketball, if you look at any realm of human existence, from little kids playing together to high school kids mediating conflicts to parenting to work, it's all about human behavior. And if you think about what's common in every aspect of human behavior, um, it's easy to find a situation.
Mhm.
So you can create simulations, you can send people out into their regular lives to do pertinent negotiation exercises. Um, I remember one story. I would always teach my students about active listening. And so many of us, while we're listening to something, we're preparing our response. And so we kind of stop listening. Um, and I said, look, all I want for you to do between Tuesday's class and Thursday's class is every time you think someone has finished talking and you're about to say something, I just want you to count slowly to five, like five Mississippi. And on Thursday, the students came back and I said, okay, so tell me stories. And the stories are hilarious, right? So one person says, my spouse wondered what happened to me. They thought it was good, but they wondered like, um, and one person said, well, I paid for all of law school. I was like, okay, tell me that story. And they said, before law school, I worked in the wine distribution industry and I kept some of my clients to help me defray the cost during law school. So it's Tuesday afternoon after class. I'm making a deal with somebody and they put a number out on the table and I just count to doing my count to five Mississippi. I get to about two and they say, okay, okay. And they gave me a better offer. And I was about to say yes, but I said, I have to count to five. I counted. And again, this time at about three, they said, all right, final offer. So they basically negotiated against themselves twice. And the savings between the first offer that I was ready to accept and the third offer that I finally accepted is it enough of a differential that it's paying for about a year and a half of my tuition.
Wow.
So when you ask, how do you go from theory into practice? Um, well, this is theory about practice.
Yeah.
Um, this when people say, how do you describe your profession? And so I have to say, it's like I teach mediation, negotiation, but really, if you want to get nerdy about it, it's applied decision theory.
Mhm.
Many people have tried to figure out how do people make decisions. Psychologists, economists, game theorists, lawyers, cross-cultural folks. I mean, there's just so many different disciplines that inform that. And everybody makes decisions all the time. And so we take insights from these various realms and then we apply them to business, government, medicine, higher ed, consumer behavior, day-to-day behavior. Um, so I think the connection, at least for me, it's sort of like synesthesia. People who hear in color. Um, I see theory alive in every mundane human interaction. And I can often, at least in my head, and sometimes depending if it's appropriate in the environment, name the concept at play. It's like, oh, that's about risk framing. And so just thinking like, a very simple example, we tend to become risk seeking in the face of losses and risk averse in the face of gains. And whether something is a gain or a loss is often a matter of perspective, which could be manipulated. So in trial behavior, like if someone, let's just say, someone offered to buy your podcast for $10 million, the right to do your podcast, and you were ready to say yes, uh, and someone else swoops in and corrupts that deal. They say, I have a better podcast and I'll sell it to you for, and now you sue them because you've lost $10 million because somebody interfered in an illegal way. All right, well, 2 years from now, you might find yourself in a JAMS office mediating, and there's a $5 million offer on the table. If you accept it, are you up 5 million relative to the zero you have in your bank account now?
Mhm.
Or are you down 5 million relative to what your expectation was? And that matters a lot because if
Yeah.
I said, I'm going to give you $5 million right now, do you want to flip a coin and go double or nothing? You might think, well, I know 10 million is better than five, but I don't want to flip that coin because if I lose the five in my hand, I'll feel dumb.
Yeah.
But if I say you owe me $5 million, you want to flip a coin, you're like, oh yeah. And so it's a coin flip for $5 million. And whether it's a gain or a loss determines whether you want to seek risk or avoid it. And so in many situations, like if you're mediating a litigated case, um, the trial might represent a chance to go up double or nothing, or it might represent the only chance to recoup your losses. The same is true in normal workplace behavior. Do you accept an extra assignment or not? Whether we frame these things as gains or losses has huge impact on the decisions we make.
Mhm.
So one of the lessons I like to tell people, it's a little opaque, is update your baselines constantly. If you think of yourself as a $10 million person and you have a $5 million offer on the table, you're going to reject it and you're going to say, I got to go to trial. I got to spend more money on lawyers. I got to dig double down. And you engage in risk-seeking behavior that's often calculated to make things worse. If you just say, oh, I guess I have zero in my account and a lottery ticket called a lawsuit, $5 million sounds pretty good. And all of a sudden you're in the, I gave you $5 million. Do you want to flip and go double or nothing? You're like, no, I want to, as opposed to thinking of it as I'm down $5 million. I have to engage in bad behavior. So, these little tiny things that are applicable all the time,
Mhm.
update your baselines, you'll make better decisions and you'll be a happier person.
I
But
really
those are,
appreciate
it's hard to do.
it is. I appreciate your answer in that, this field of conflict resolution, it's this human field, right? And so insofar, I see all the books behind you. I've got a few books behind me,
Yeah.
and I judge them as to whether or not I think they're getting human nature right. And you can have any theory you want, but if you're getting humans wrong, and I think the same thing about when I read fiction, it's not where it's set, it's the people. Did you get people right? And that's what is compelling. And it doesn't matter that we're in space and there are aliens. It's, what is this how people really interact? Is this ringing true?
Hmm.
And so conflict resolution, I also, do lots of training, and I really try to impress that this is about you and how it applies to you.
Hmm.
Because if you're just sitting there and listening, you're like, well, I'm not sure if that would work for me. Then it's, well, how will it work for you? How can you find out? How can you apply it? What can you do right now? What have you done in the past? And and the more that you do it, I think of it. So I taught philosophy for a very long time, and
Hmm.
I am a bit of an existentialist. That's what I think about humans, but I'm a virtue ethicist, and so I think the way that you develop conflict resolution skills is like a virtue by doing it. And as soon as you do it, you see what feels right for you and how the other person reacted, and whether or not you quote unquote got the outcome you wanted. You did get an outcome of you tried it and you saw what didn't work, which is a win. And then you try
Hmm.
another thing and you get more confidence to try something else. And you get it by doing it. And the doing is being embodied in the messiness of yourself with others who are embodied, messy individuals. And yet there
Hmm.
is this human nature that frames us all. So it's both and, it's sort of like the law and art. There is something about human nature, but then we're all individuals within that space. And so this, asking people to look into their past or into their relationships right now to try these things out. That's what I always tell people. Go with the low-hanging fruit. Don't think about the person who you might term as your work nemesis to try this out on. Don't start there. Start with a friend and
Right.
talk about, when we go out to lunch, I've noticed that you normally say, but I would like to have a say. Let's talk about that. Somebody you're already friendly with, but might feel a little difficult. Whatever those skills are that you're working on, try it with them. And you maybe even say, hey, I want to try this out on you. Will you let me try it out? Any way to start that ball rolling. And so my life in philosophy is very ethereal, but gosh, I love conflict resolution because it's always concrete particular. That's where it lives. And the theory is to always to serve it, but it's never about the theory, right? It's about concrete people, people in their individuality trying to do the best they can with others. And the theory can give us some tools to reframe and think and try, but it's only as good as is it actually working for the people who are trying it.
100%. There's obviously in the social sciences, there's been these big issues about replicability.
Hmm.
So people do, they sort
Yeah.
of set up a little pristine experiment, they get an outcome that they like, and it turns out that that's not replicable. I've always been attracted to those aspects of theory that are ubiquitous.
Mhm.
Um, if I see it in movies, if I see it in my life, if I hear about it in song, if I read about it in literature, if these seem to be part and parcel, it's like at the end of the day, you hear about a concept, and instead of saying, huh, wow, that's earth shattering, if I say, oh, that's a good name for that,
Right. Yeah.
then I feel like, okay, that's resonant. And
Yeah.
those are the pieces that I like to pass along. For example, just thinking about like uh, advice that I've taken and advice that I give. Um, I think that the advice that I take and the advice that I give are independent of what age, what profession, right? So
Mhm.
two pieces of advice that I've been given that I think are important. One is always take the high road. And that's our current CEO, a woman who's just recently, she's been with our company for 25 years, but now she's in the head. She just said, look, whatever the situation is, there's a more higher path. Try to find it.
Mhm.
And the second one is when someone offers a critique, um, even if it's absurd, try it on.
Mhm.
They say, you resemble a green Martian with two heads. Instead of saying, no, I don't, just say, huh, what motivated you to say that?
Mhm.
Right? Let me think, is there something there? And now, advice that I give. So, again, those two pieces of advice, if you hear something negative, consider it. You can reject it and always take the high road. I mean, you could be talking to a kindergartner or a CEO.
Yeah.
And then advice I give. Now, one was the update your baseline piece because that's better decision making. I tell people, look, every decision you make boils down to three simple questions. What do I want? What's available? What happens if there's no deal? And it ends up being status quo versus a change measured by my interests. Very simple questions, super hard in the execution. Like
Mhm.
just asking, what do I want?
Right.
Well, I don't know. Every night I want to both lose weight and eat that pint of Ben and Jerry's. So, thinking about sorting out what I want is dynamic.
Yeah.
And then the final one, and this is I say this in all earnestness, even though it could be interpreted as self-serving. Um, Partner with a professional. I've been in the conflict resolution field, um, well, maybe as long as I've been alive, but formally for decades and decades, um, full time, doing applied work, everything from working with little kids to truly, I think the largest matter I handled, $13 billion in controversy,
Mhm.
right? So everything, uh, and uh, there are folks who believe that because they learn to get along with their siblings, they know everything they need to know and they should be able to do it themselves. Or they say, I have a general counsel, I have an HR department. And it's like, there are people who devote their whole lives to figuring out what is the right intervention at the right time. Um, so when people say, what does your work look like? I say, it looks like a lot of people talking to each other,
Mm.
but who's talking to whom about what and what order? Uh, and is it a safe environment in which to have that conversation? Um, those are the things that a professional can bring.
Mhm.
So just as you say, my tax life has gotten complicated enough that I need to hire an accountant, or I need to have surgery, and so I'm not going to do that myself. Folks get involved in conflict and they believe that they should have the skills to do it on their
Mhm.
own. But really, what you ought to do is partner with a professional. So those are my three pieces of advice. Just basically seek help. So, like I say, those pieces of advice, I think they're applicable to everyday workplace stuff,
Yeah.
um, no matter what your workplace is.
I love that. I love it. And just focus on the last thing that you said about seeking help, seeking professionals. And I think you're so right. I see this all the time. People just don't think they should need help, or other people should just get it together. Everyone needs to be professional here. And it's this narrative, this stumbling block to actually getting help and actually making things better. And I think every place should have an ombuds or conflict resolution, or everyone should have access so that we can deal with things, I say, early, often, swiftly, justly, so that we don't have to escalate to even mediation or facilitated conversations, let alone legal. We need all those things, but gosh, helping people solve their own problems so that um yeah. Well, Richard, my goodness, I can't believe this time has passed. I could just talk to you
Yeah,
for
we
a
could go.
very
Yeah,
long
we
time.
could keep going. One of the prep questions that I got in advance was talk about what makes a happy workplace, and I thought ours, the place where I work, we have 450 conflict resolvers and about 300 support staff, and we have phenomenal leadership. They walk their talk. They set a really good tone. They're open to hearing from people. They kind of do that listening without reacting. Um, the nature of our profession is to help, and we are psychologically safe enough that people can critique and offer new ideas and get rewarded for that. And we have all the different mechanisms from anonymous to confidential to open and public. And we communicate constantly without judgment. So I think if you're looking for a good workplace, those are some attributes that I would encourage for folks. Leaders walk your talk. Um, if you got promoted up off the line to be a manager, stop and take into account that not every player makes a good coach. So you better learn that transition um, and keep the lines of communication flowing. Um, Not necessarily a recipe for you know, happiness, but if there is a recipe, it's that.
Yeah. So before we go, I would just like to hear just a few minutes on JAMS pathways. And so that's where
Great.
you currently work. Can you tell us just, and I know where I don't want to keep you longer than we said, but if you could just tell us just a little bit about that and maybe how you have helped, obviously this is your baby, bring about this large environment that is a healthy environment.
Sure. I'll make this as quick as possible, but it's not a super short story. When I took a position at the law school where I spent 22 years and I was running a dispute resolution program, mediation was just first starting, and a lot of alumni and trustees wanted to get into the mediation game. And they didn't want me to come into town and compete with them. And so I sort of made a pledge that I was going to do uh, three or four or five things in a field, and then that would be it. I would never specialize. I would just keep learning from different areas so that I would be better equipped as a teacher. Um, well, what ends up happening is you get a reputation for doing unusual things. And after 20 some years, I realized that about 80% of the portfolio of my consulting practice, my applied work, um, didn't fit the standard boxes of mediation arbitration. And I thought, boy, if I could fill my plate and pick any one of these events and sort of turn it into a profession, there are professions that don't exist yet. There are conflict resolution interventions that are not commonplace. And my goal was to turn that into a career for intra-organizational, things where it's like you don't want the nurses suing the surgeons because they don't like the interactions that are occurring in the break room.
Right.
Um, so JAMS has built an enormous uh, company based primarily on the resolution of litigated matters. And yet we have all of these talented people who are waiting for the litigation to get so titanic that we get hired. And so my pitch to the company was we should be a more full service organization. We should be available to organizations that will never end up in litigation, that never should end up in litigation. And that means that, things are going to look a little bit different, but it's still going to be the same skill sets. So we just need to do just a slight perspective shift. The biggest issue is that we've been able to be an enormous company, mostly marketing to litigators. And the audience for the non-litigated dispute are business people who, as we discussed, have all the like, I don't want to bring in a professional. I have to admit something went wrong. I have to air my dirty laundry. And I sort of say, it's like, if it's a plumbing leak, do you call a plumber? It's a sign of courage and wisdom to bring in the right person. So Pathways is about unique crafted interventions that exist outside of the world of litigation. They may be informed by it. You can tell people, look, if this goes badly, these are the kind of things that could happen. This is what an employment discrimination lawsuit is likely to do to your company and your bottom line. But we're at a place now where we can actually create an environment where that would never happen. And so Pathways is some of it's training, some of it's relatively short interventions, and sometimes it's longer. We've been involved in universities where we've been working with 6 or 7 different departments, and the president has then said, you've done such a good job with these departments, I want you to create culture change on the campus. And so some of these turn out to be really wonderful partnerships that last, in some instances, a couple of years. Our goal isn't to be there forever. I mean, if you're talking about, you want to equip people, put the fire out, equip people to prevent the next fire, and then move on. If we find ourselves in a place too long, unless it's a sprawling organization where they say, I have an issue on this other campus, if we're there too long, I feel like, well, we have done something wrong. So Pathways is, it's at least worth a phone call to say, is there something that we can offer that might be helpful to you at your workplace?
Yeah, that's wonderful. I just love, right? We want early dispute resolution. We want to help people. The longer it goes, the worse it gets. Not, the magical thinking that it will disappear. It's the opposite typically. So that's wonderful.
Yeah, very few things go away on their own.
Right. Well, Richard, thank you so much for your time. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you for hosting me, Mary. Have a great rest of the day.
You too. Take care.
Bye.
Richard, thank you so much for being on Conflict Managed. I really appreciate the work that you have been doing for decades on helping people have healthy work environments and all the other kinds of disputes that you are interested in helping people navigate, and also teaching practitioners to go out into the fields and do this kind of work. Conflict Managed is produced by third-party workplace conflict restoration services and hosted by me, Mary Brown. You can find us online at 3pconflictrestoration.com. Come back. We have new episodes every Tuesday. And if you wouldn't mind, please like, follow, subscribe, whatever platform you're on, listening to this or watching this, we really appreciate it. Our music is courtesy of Dove Pilot. And if you haven't had a chance to check out my book, How to Be Unprofessional at Work, Tips to Ensure Failure, it's 80 tips of what not to do, and encourages people instead to think about what we need to do to have a healthy work environment. And remember, conflict is normal and expected. Let's deal with it. Until next time, take care.